Do you feel a shiver up your spine from fear? Yes, it's another story from the Nightshade diary. You know what that means. Check under the bed and make sure no one or nothing is there. Is the closet door securely shut? Then leave your disbelief behind. Amp up your imagination and hang on tight for another ride into terror and mystery. And like all good horror stories, just imagine it's a dark and stormy night. And remember, screaming like a little girl is permitted. Footprints by A.M. Burrage. Sir Arnold Zombie and his son Reggie had gone into the billiard room after dinner. The butler brought them coffee and noticed that they ceased speaking when he entered the room. Sir Arnold hummed a tune as he helped himself to sugar, a sure sign that he was keeping a tight hold on his temper. Mr. Reggie, the servant observed, seemed out of sorts. The cup and saucer rattled in his hand as he took them. Barlow left the billiard room with a distinct impression that there was something wrong. Sir Arnold Zombie was stout, red-faced, well-preserved, standing over 6 feet high in his low-heeled evening shoes. He had lived hard, ridden hard, and drunk hard all his life, and now that age was approaching, gout and a hobnailed liver were enforcing the debts he owed to nature. A big, blatant blackguard of a man, this boastful of the evil he had done, looking back with relish on a life full of vicious memories. His son Reggie took after his dead mother in most things. He was a tall, slim young man of 23 with a girlish face. He stood in mortal dread of his father, who treated him with ill-disguised contempt. He was reading for the bar, with very little chance of being called, and no chance at all of making a living for himself, if he were. When the butler had gone, Sir Arnold turned sharply toward his son, who was searching in the pockets of the table for chalk. "Now, Reggie," he said sharply, "what's the matter with you? Let's hear what you've got to say. You've been throwing out hints all day long. Why the deuce can't you speak straight out and have done with it?" Reggie turned and leaned against the table, one arm along the cushion. His fingers moved nervously, tapping and stroking the cloth. What he had to say required all his courage, and the look on his father's face seemed to balk him of speech. "I want to get married, sir," he said at length, with an obvious effort. He spoke quickly, lest his resolution should fail him before the sentence was completed, and the words seemed to jostle one another as they fell from his lips. Sir Arnold's deep-throated chuckle of genuine amusement almost reassured him. "Then why the devil couldn't you have said so before, instead of beating about the bush all day?" the baronet demanded. "Dash it, man, I thought you'd been cheating at cards or something from the way you'd been going on. I didn't say you couldn't marry if you can find a girl fool enough to have you, did I? If the girl's all right, I don't mind allowing both of you enough to live on until you step into my shoes. Is it that Wharton girl?" "No, sir," Reggie answered, flushing, and then added, as he saw another question framing itself on his father's lips, It's no one you know. I met her in town." "I see," Sir Arnold chuckled. "Some little trap your Aunt Polly let you in for, I'll wager. Well, tell me all about her." The young man began to stammer. He drew away from the table so that he stood outside the radius of the shaded lights. "I didn't meet her at Aunt Polly's," he confessed. She's a shop girl." He hung his head and waited for the torrent of his father's wrath to be loosened. But there was a profound silence for nearly a minute, broken only by the garrulous ticking of a little clock. It seemed to mimic his own hurried, uneven tones. "Is this a joke, Reggie?" Sir Arnold said at last. "Good heavens, no, sir." The words seemed to be jerked out of the young man. "Do you think I should joke on such subject?" "No," Sir Arnold echoed, pursing his lips. "No, I'm very much afraid you think you mean it." "Good Lord! And you're my son. Didn't you know me better than to come to me with such a tale, you fool?" "But, father—" "Look here, my boy," the baronet continued rapidly with an odd kindliness in his tone. "I don't want to be hard on you. Just be a bit sensible, and you won't regret it. I had a good time myself when I was young, and I don't want you to stint. You shall have an extra 100 tomorrow. I shan't grumble at increasing your allowance, and I don't care a hang what you do as long as you keep outside the registry office. When I was a young man—" Reggie flushed like a girl. "You don't understand," he exclaimed. I want to be fair to her. I want to marry her." Sir Arnold did not storm. Such was not the way with him when he was deeply moved. It was only on trivial occasions that he displayed a broad and catholic taste in oaths. He merely shrugged his shoulders. "Well," he said, "I can stop you. You are of age, you know. Will you pardon my curiosity if I inquire how you mean to live?" The younger man did not answer. "You've been counting on me, I suppose. Well, you've made a miscalculation. Did you think I was going to pay for the honor of having some ageless little gutter snipe in my family? Did you, Reggie? You're the biggest fool that ever breathed. And you're my son. My son." "I thought," Reggie faltered, "you might. I've never given you any trouble yet, sir. And she's quite presentable. Or nearly." The baronet threw what remained of his small stock of patience to the wind. "Do you imagine that I'm going to put up with a daughter-in-law who's nearly presentable?" he demanded, "when half the girls in the county would jump at the chance of one day becoming Lady Zombie? Why on earth are you such a fool, Reggie? Why can't you chuck her, if only for your own sake?" "Because I love her, sir." The words were spoken haltingly, but with a note of defiance which did not escape Sir Arnold, who sighed. "I was afraid that was coming," he said. "If you were a boy of 16, I could understand it, and be amused. But you're too old now for me to laugh at you." "Whatever you say," Reggie muttered. "I must marry her." "Why must you?" Reggie licked his dry lips and lowered his eyes, after glancing once at his father's fierce red face. Slowly the truth dawned on Sir Arnold's not very active imagination. "You don't mean," he gasped, drawing a long breath, "you don't mean that... Yes." The young man took up his cup and began to stir the dregs of his coffee. "Now you see why it's necessary for me to..." Sir Arnold seated himself on the edge of the table and regarded his carefully manicured nails. "I don't see your point of view at all," he said. "Perhaps she is only trying to blackmail you." "No, she's not that sort," the son answered. "She's a respectable girl. Her people are respectable." "Of course," Sir Arnold sneered. "They always are. Parson's daughter, isn't she? Offer a couple of hundred without prejudice. I'll write you out a check tomorrow." The younger man passed a hot hand across his forehead. "I can't do that," he cried. "My responsibility doesn't end there, and you know it. She expects me to marry her. It's the only thing left for me to do." "It's not your duty to sacrifice your career for her. Your duty to the family comes first. The woman must pay. That is one of the first laws of society." "But she won't pay all," the other cried. "Neither shall I. The guiltless one will suffer a whole lifetime. It's not fair. It's not right." Sir Arnold shrugged his shoulders. "You are talking like a fool," he said. "All of us have to pay for our existence by inheriting something from our parents that we would sooner be without. I inherited gout from mine. You can see that your child has a fair start in life. But the subject of marriage is closed," said Sir Arnold firmly. "I can see what's worrying you. Well, I'll take all the responsibility in the sight of heaven. A little more or less won't make any difference. But mind, if you dare to disobey me, you can go to the devil. You won't get another halfpenny from me while I live." Reggie turned away with a sob in his throat. "All right," he muttered. "You know I can't afford to quarrel with you. I hope you're satisfied now that your infernal money has brought your son's honor." The passage of nearly 3 years had left its trace on Reginald Zombie. In many ways he had approached nearer to his father's ideal. He followed the hounds with extraordinary fortitude, considering that his heart seemed to turn at ice at every jump. He had acquired an average taste for strong liquors and a capacity for holding them like a gentleman. Sir Arnold was pleased to note a growing breadth of view and fewer signs of what he called a dame school sense of honor. Moreover, Reginald was engaged to marry the daughter of a neighboring family, a lady whose deficiencies were well screened by her undisputed social position and roseate expectations. In a word, Reginald was doing the right thing by his people. To look at him on that December evening, however, did not suggest that he was at peace with the world. The shivering tout who held open for him the door of the taxi and took his sixpence pitied him. His face was pale and haggard, his eyes sunken and dull. Damocles, sitting at the banquet on the suspended sword, might have looked less ghastly. The motor cab drew up before the entrance to a block of small flats in St. John's Woods. Reggie alighted and paid the man, and as the cab drove away, walked cautiously up the steps and passed through under the great lamp. Inside it was dark and cold and cheerless. Stone steps led from floor to floor, and these were slippery with snow, caked and melting, which many pairs of feet had brought in from the cheerless streets. There were footprints in which Reggie took a morbid, half-conscious interest, and caught himself speculating as to which were the doctor's. He knocked at a door on the second floor, and a woman came and opened it. A single bulb of electric light burned in the passage behind her, but even in the dimness which concealed so much, her face was not pleasant to gaze upon. To Reggie's surprise, she had not been crying, or at least, her face bore no trace of tears. Her eyes, slightly protruding, shone as if they reflected the light of a fierce fire. There was an expression in them which the man could not fathom, but in that instant he realized with a sudden painful shock the meaning of the word horror. He almost recoiled from her. "Come in," was all she said. He entered, feeling his way in spite of the light. As the door closed behind him, he turned and faced her. He now saw that her face was drawn and haggard, and that her high cheekbones stood out in unwonted prominence. She looked like a passé woman of 35, whereas she was not yet 22. He read in her face all that he had feared, so that the question he put was almost superfluous. "Yes," she answered, in a colorless voice, "the child is dead." He did not ask any further questions. He coughed and struggled with an unfamiliar sensation in his eyes and throat. The woman saw tears glisten on his lashes, and some of the hardness left her face. Her own eyes grew wet, and suddenly she came to him, resting her head on his shoulder and twining her fingers behind his neck. "Reggie," she sobbed. "Reggie, Reggie." He muttered something, but neither knew what he said. He no longer loved her, but a great pity was choking him. His thoughts, for the most part, centered themselves on the dead child, his child. He had seen it once or twice and loved it in spite of himself. Nature implants parental affection even among the animals, who neither marry nor give in marriage. His life was not lightened of a burden. He had lost a son. "I loved him too," the woman whispered presently. "Dear God, if he only had a name to die with, a name to be written in the registry of heaven." Her face quivered with passion. "I wish that scoundrel was here to hear me curse him," she panted. "Your precious father, who made a coward of you and robbed our boy of birthright. Father and honor. Your father, with his sneer and his light regard for virtue. He who was to be responsible, on his own wishing, in the light of heaven. I wish—" Her voice rose to a high pitch and cracked. Further speech was stifled by sobs that racked her body. The man did his utmost to soothe her, half awed, half irritated by her violent grief. Presently she recovered the use of her voice. "I know what you're thinking," she exclaimed violently. "You're thinking that a real lady wouldn't go on like this. I don't care. Oh, don't mind what I'm saying, Reggie." Her voice suddenly sank into a whisper. "Would you like to see him?" she asked tremulously. He nodded, and she led the way into a dimly lit bedroom, pausing by the switch to turn on another light. Reggie tiptoed across the thin carpet until he stood in the middle of the room, where he remained stationary. The dead child lay in a cot drawn up close beside a big brass bedstead. He did not approach any nearer. Now that the child was dead, a vague, unreasoning fear of it came over him. He was not squeamish of death itself, but he knew that somewhere in some world a soul was wandering, a soul as powerful as his own. It was not a child any longer. It had become a being. The woman came and stood beside him. She turned her face towards that of the dead child, and as she gazed upon it, all the softness that remained in her expression faded away. Her eyes blazed suddenly with the malevolence of a demon, and she went over to the cot and lifted the dead child in her arms. Reggie fidgeted and looked away. There was something weird about the woman, something subtly repulsive. He heard the soft sound of impassioned whispering, and his heart began to flutter. It is not nice to hear a woman whispering to her dead. Presently the sound ceased, and Reggie looked up. The woman's eyes met his across the room. "My son has heard me," she said in a hushed voice. "Mabel," he pleaded, "don't." "My son has heard me," she repeated. "I had a message. Sir Arnold shall stand by the words he spoke so slightly. My son shall take his hand and lead him to the judgment seat. A child shall lead him, a little child, my son. Her voice died away into an unintelligible muttering. Her eyes closed in a swoon. Reggie was at her side just in time to save her from falling. Early on the following morning, Reggie received a telegram. It was from Barlow, and to the effect that Sir Arnold had died suddenly on the previous night. When the new baronet had partly recovered from the shock, but not from the haunting sense of horror that accompanied it, he drove straight to King's Cross and took the first train home. Barlow greeted him as the hired fly from the station drew up before the hall door. The old man's face was as white as the snow that lay like a cloak over the land. The sudden death of his old master seemed to have affected him more than the dead man's son. "I'm glad you managed to come down so quick, sir," he said. "How did it happen?" was Reggie's first question. "He died, sitting in his chair in the library last night," Barlow whispered as he took his master's hat and coat. "We left him there until you came, sir." The old man's lips twisted and straightened again. "Dr. Mekovich has been in, sir. Says it was heart failure caused by a shock." Reggie took a step in the direction of a chair. A feeling of weakness and nausea had come over him. "What sort of shock?" he asked, in a voice that was unlike his own. "Nobody quite knows, sir," Barlow muttered hoarsely. The new baronet gathered together all his courage. "Take me to him, Barlow," he commanded. They climbed the stairs together. The library was on the first floor. It was originally intended for a bedroom, but Sir Arnold had made the alteration to suit his own convenience. Together they entered the chamber of death. The dead man sat upright in a cane-backed chair before a small table, on which were a glass, a decanter of whiskey, a siphon, and a box of cigars. A cigar had burned itself out between his fingers. His eyes were wide opened, and his gaze was directed low down towards the door. They were eyes that seemed to see something, even in death, something not to be mentioned, scarcely to be thought of. There was a whole inferno of terror concentrated in that gaze. Reggie uttered a low cry and reeled, but the strong arm of Barlow held him up. He took only one glance at his father and looked away. Saw the wide-open, terror-stricken eyes, the parted lips, the head thrust forward to the full extent of the neck. "Barlow," he gasped, "tell me how it happened." "How am I to know, sir?" "You know something," the other insisted. "For God's sake, tell me." "Yes, sir, I do know something." The voice was hushed and quavering. "But I covered up the tracks, trod them out one by one, and nobody'll ever know but me and you. I saw them, sir, when I first went out after the doctor, when James had woke me up and told me what had happened." He paused for breath. Each man could hear his own heart beating quickly and irregularly. "There's no snow under the fir plantation, sir," Barlow continued in a strained voice, "and the footprints commenced just on the edge. They went across into the drive and up the drive to the front door. There was a print on every step, sir. There was wet prints in the hall, and just dabs here and there on the stairs. The last one was on the polished boards just inside the library, sir. Just over there by the door, where I'm pointing. I wiped them up, sir, with my own hands, and kicked snow over the ones outside." He held his young master more firmly by the arm. When he continued speaking, his voice had sunk so that it was almost inaudible. "Mr. Reggie, sir, they were the naked footprints of a little child." The Haunted Dragoon by Arthur Quiller Couch. Besides the Plymouth Road as it plunges downhill past Ron Lannyhale Church toward Ron Cove, and 10 paces beyond the Lich Gate, where the graves lie level with the coping, and the horseman can decipher the inscriptions in passing. At the risk of a twisted neck, the base of the churchyard wall is pierced with a low archway, festooned with toad flax and fringed with the hart's tongue fern. Within the archway bubbles a well, the water of which was once used for all baptisms in the parish, for no child sprinkled with it could ever be hanged with hemp. But this belief is discredited now, and the well neglected, and the events which led to this are still a winter's tale in the neighborhood. I set them down as they were told me, across the blue glow of a wreckwood fire, by Sam Tregear, the parish bedman. Sam himself had borne an inconspicuous share in them, and because of them Sam's father, had carried a white face to his grave. My father and mother, said Sam, married late in life, for his trade what was mine is, and 'twasn't till her 40th year that my mother could bring herself to kiss a grave digger. That accounts maybe for my being born rickety, and with other drawbacks that only made father the fonder. Weather permitting, he'd carry me off to churchyard, set me upon a flat stone, with his coat folded under, and talk to me while he delved. I can mind now the way he settled lower and lower, till his head played hidey-peep with me over the grave's edge, and at last he'd be clean swallowed up, but still discussing or calling up how he'd come upon wonderful towns and kingdoms down underground, and how all the kings and queens there in dyed garments was offering him meat for his dinner every day of the week if he'd only stop and hobby-nob with them, and all such a gamut. He prettily doted on me, the poor old ancient. But there came a day, a dry afternoon in the late wheat harvest, when we were up in the churchyard together, and though father had his tools beside him, not a tint did he work, but kept travishing back and forth, one time shading his eyes and gazing out to sea, and then looking far along the Plymouth road for minutes at a time. Up Braddon Point there stood a little dandy rigged craft, tacking lazily to and fro with her mains all shiny yellow in the sunset. Though I didn't know it then, she was the preventative boat, and her business was to watch the Howen, for there had been a brush between her and the Unity lugger a fortnight back, and a preventative man shot through the breastbone, and my mother's brother Philip was hiding down in the town. I minded later how that the men across the vale in Farmer Tressider's wheat field paused every now and then as they pitched the sheaves to give a look up towards the churchyard, and the gleaners moved about in small knots, causing and glancing over their shoulders at the cutter out in the bay, and how when all the field was carried they waited round the last load, no man offering to cry the neck, as the fashion was, but lingering till sun was near down behind the slope, and the long shadow stretched across the stubble. "Shan't thee go underground today, father?" says I at last. He turns slowly round and he says, "No, sonny, reckon us will climb skyward for a change." And with that he took my hand, and pushing abroad the belfry door, began to climb the stairway. Up and up, round and round we went, in a sort of blind man's holiday, full of little glints of light and whiffs of wind where the windows open came, and at last stepped out upon the leads of the tower and drew breath. "There's 22 parishes to be witnessed from where we're standing, sonny, if you've got eyes," says my father. Well, first I looked down towards the harvesters and laughed to see them so small, and then I fell to counting the church towers dotted across the highlands and seeing if I could make out 22. 'Twas the prettiest sight, all the country round looking as if it was dusted with gold, and the Plymouth road winding away over the hills like a long white cape. I had counted 13 churches. My father pointed his hand out along this road and called to me, "Look out yonder, honey, and say what you see." "I see dust," says I. "Nothing else?" "Sonny boy, use your eyes, for mine be dim." "I see dust," says I again, "and something twinkling in it like a tin can." "Dragooniers," shouts my father, and then running to the side of the tower facing the harvest field, he put both hands to his mouth and called, "What have he? What have he?" very loud and long. "A neck! A neck!" came back from the field, like as if all shouted at once. Dear the sweet sound, and then a gun was fired, and craning forward over the coping I saw a dozen men running across the stubble and out into the road towards the Howen, and they called as they ran, "A neck! A neck!" "Is," said my father, "'tis a neck, sure enough. Pray God they save him. Come, sonny." But we dallied up there till the horsemen were plain to see, and their scarlet coats and armor blazing in the dust as they came. And when they drew near within a mile, and our limbs ached with crouching, for fear they should spy us against the sky, father took me by the hand and pulled hot foot down the stairs. Before they rode by, he had picked up his shovel and was shoveling out a grave for his life. 40 valiant horsemen they were, riding 2 and 2, by reason of the narrowness of the road, and the captain beside them. Men broad and long, with hairy top lips and all clad in scarlet jackets and white breeches that showed bravely against their black war horses and jet black holsters, thick as they were with dust. Each man had a golden helmet and a scabbard flapping by his side, and a piece of metal like a half-moon jingling from his horse's cheap-strap. 12D was the number on every saddle, meaning the 12th Dragoons. Tramp, tramp, they rode by, talking and joking, and taking no more heed of me that sat upon the wall, with my heels dangling above them, than if I'd been a sprig of stonecrop. But the captain, who carried a drawn sword and mopped his face with a handkerchief so that the dust ran streaks, drew rein, and looked over my shoulder to where the father was digging. "Sergeant," he calls back, turning with a hand upon his crupper. "Didn't we see a figure like this atop of the tower some way back?" The sergeant pricked his horse forward and saluted. He was the tallest, straightest man in the troop, and the muscles on his arms filled out his sleeves with the 3 stripes upon it. A handsome red-faced fellow with curly black hair. Says he, "That we did, sir, a man with sloping shoulders, and a boy with a gooseneck." Saying this, he looked up at me with a grin. "I'll bear it in mind," answered the officer, and the troop rode on in a cloud of dust, the sergeant looking back and smiling as if 'twas a joke that he shared with us. Well, to be short, they rode down into the town as night fell, but 'twas too late, Uncle Philip having had fair warning and plenty of time to flee up toward the little secret hold under Maple Down, where none but 2 families knew how to find him. All the town, though, knew he was safe, and lashings of women and children turned out to see the comely soldiers hunt in vain till 10 o'clock that night. The next thing was to billet the warriors. The captain of the troops by this was pesky, cross-tempered, and flounced off to the jolly pilchards in a huff. "Sergeant," says he, "here's an inn, though, a damn bad one, and here I means to stop. Somewheres about there's a farm called Constantine, where I am told the men can be accommodated. Find out the place if you can, and do your best, and don't let me see your face till tomorrow," says he. So Sergeant Basket, that was his name, gave the salute and rode his troops up the street where, for his manners were mighty winning, and notwithstanding the dirty nature of his errand, he soon found plenty to direct them to Farmer Noyes of Constantine, and up the coombe they rode into the darkness, a dozen or more going along with them to show the way, being won by their martial bearing as well as the sergeant's very friendly way of speech. Farmer Noy was in bed, a pock-marked, lantern-jawed old gaffer of 65, and the most remarkable point about him was the wife he had married 2 years before, a young slip of a girl, but just husband high. Money did it, I reckon, but if so, 'twas a bad bargain for her. He was noted for his stinginess to such a degree they said that his wife wore a brass wedding ring, weekdays to save the genuine article from wearing out. She was a Rouen woman too, and therefore ought to have known all about him, but women's ways be past finding out. Hearing the hoofs in his yard and the sergeant's dram-a-ram upon the door, down comes the old curmudgeon with a candle held high above his head. "What the devil's here?" he calls out. Sergeant Basket looks over the old man's shoulder, and there, halfway up the stairs, stood Madame Noy, in her all-night rail, a high-colored ripe girl languishing for love, her red lips parted, and neck all lily-white against a loosened pile of dark brown hair. "Be cussed if I turn back," said the sergeant to himself, and added out loud, "40 soldiers in the king's name." "40 devils," says old Noy. "They've devils to eat," answered the sergeant in the most friendly manner, "and, begad, you must feed 'em and bed 'em this night, or else I'll search your cellars. You're a loyal man, farmer, and your stables are big, I'm told." "Sarah," calls out the old man, following the sergeant's bold glance, "go back and dress yourself decently this instant. These honest soldiers, 40 damn honest Scotsmanishing soldiers, be come in His Majesty's name, 40 strong, to protect honest folks right in the intervals of eating them out of house and home. Sergeant, you be very welcome in the king's name. Cheese and cider you shall have, and I pray the mixture may turn your 40 stomachs." In a dozen minutes he had fetched out his stable boys and farm hands, and, lantern in hand, was helping the sergeant to picket the horses and stow the men about unclean straws in the outhouse. They were turning back to the house, and the old man was turning over in his mind that the sergeant hadn't yet said a word about where he was to sleep, When by the door they found Madame Noy waiting in her wedding gown, and with her hair freshly braided. Now the farmer was mortally afraid of the sergeant, knowing that he had 30 anchors and more of contraband liquor in his cellars, and minding the sergeant's threat. None the less his jealousy got the upper hand. Woman, he cries out, to thy bed. I was waiting, said she, to say the captain's bed. Sergeant, says the dragoon, correcting her. Was lady the spare room? Madam, replies Sergeant Basket, looking into her eyes and bowing, a soldier with my responsibility sleeps but little. In the first place, I must see that my men sup. The maids be now cutting the bread and cheese and drawing the cider. Then, madam, leave me but possession of the parlour, and let me have a chair to sleep in. By this they were in the passage together, and her gaze devouring his regimentals. The old man stood a pace off, looking sourly. The sergeant fed his eyes upon her, and Satan got hold of him. Now if only, said he, one of you could play cards. But I must go to bed, she answered, though I can play cribbage, if only you stay another night. For she saw the glint in the farmer's eye, and so Sergeant Basket slept bolt upright that night in an armchair by the parlour fender. Next day the dragooners searched the town again, and were billeted all about among the cottages. But the sergeant returned to Constantine, and before going to bed, this time in the spare room, played a game of cribbage with Madame Noy, the farmer smoking sulkily in his armchair. Two for his heels, said the rosy woman suddenly, halfway through the game. Sergeant, you're cheating yourself and forgetting to mark. Give me the board, I'll mark for both. She put out her hand upon the board, and Sergeant Basket closed upon it. 'Tis true, he had forgot to mark, and feeling the hot pulse in her wrists, and beholding the hunger in her eyes, 'tis to be supposed he'd have forgot his own soul. He rode away next day with his troops, but my Uncle Philip not being caught yet, and the government set on making an example of him, we hadn't seen the last of these dragoons. 'Twas a time of fear down in the town. At the dead of night, or at noonday, they came on us, 6 times in all, and for 2 months the crew of the Unity couldn't call their souls their own, but lived from day to day in secret closets, and wandered the county by night, hiding in hedges and straw houses. All that time the revenue men watched the Howen, night and day like dogs before a rat hole. But one November morning 'twas whispered abroad that Uncle Philip had made his way to Falmouth and slipped across to Guernsey. Time passed on, and the dragooners were seen no more, nor the devil-may-care face of Sergeant Basket. Up at Constantine, where he had always contrived to billet himself, 'tis to be thought pretty Madame Noy pined to see him again, kicking his spurs in the porch and smiling out of his gay brown eyes, for her face fell away from its plump condition, and the hunger in her eyes grew and grew. But a more remarkable fact was that her old husband, who wouldn't have yearned after the dragoon you'd have thought, began to dwindle and fall away too. By the New Year he was a dying man, and carried his doom on his face. And on New Year's Day he straddled his mare for the last time, and rode over to Loo to Dr. Gale's. Goody Losh, cried the doctor, taken aback by his appearance. What comes to ye, Noy? Death, says Noy. Doctor, I've been come for advice, for before this day's week I'll be a clay-cold corpse. I come to ax a favour. When they summon ye before looking at my body, that'll be past help. Go you to the little left-over corner drawer of my wife's bureau, and there you'll find a packet. You're my executor, says he, and I leaves you to deal with that packet as ye think fit. With that the farmer rode away home along that very weekend, and he was dead. The doctor, when called over, minded what the old chap had said, and sending Madame Noy on some pretence to the kitchen, went over and unlocked the little drawer with a duplicate key that the farmer had unhitched from his watch chain and given him. There was no parcel of letters, as he looked to find it, but only a small packet crumpled away in the corner. He pulled it out and gave a look and sniff and another look, then shut the drawer, locked it, strode straight downstairs to his horse, and galloped away. In 3 hours' time pretty Madame Noy was in the constable's hands upon the charge of murdering her husband by poison. They tried her next spring assize at Bodmin before the Lord Chief Justice. There wasn't evidence enough to put Sergeant Basket in the dock alongside of her, though 'twas freely guessed he knew more than anyone, saving the prisoner herself, about the arsenic that was found in the little drawer and inside the old man's body. He was subpoenaed from Plymouth and cross-examined by a great hulking King's Counsel for 3/4 of an hour, but they got nothing out of him. All through the examination, the prisoner looked at him and nodded her white face, every now and then at his answers, as much to say, "That's right, that's right. They shan't harm thee, my dear." And the love light shone in her eyes for all the court to see. But the sergeant never let his look meet it. When he stepped down at last, she gave a sob of joy and fainted bang off. They roused her up after this to hear the verdict of guilty and her doom spoken by the judge. "Prisoner at the bar," said the clerk of arraigns, "have you nothing to say why this court should not pass sentence of death?" She held tight of the rail before her and spoke out loud and clear. "My lord and gentlemen all, I be a guilty woman, and I be ready to die at once for my sin. But if you kill me now, you kill the child in my body, and he is innocent." Well, 'twas found she spoke the truth, and the hanging was put off till after the time of her delivery. She was led back to prison, and there, about the end of June, her child was born, and died before he was 6 hours old. But the mother recovered and quietly abode the time of her hanging. I can mind her execution very well, for father and mother had determined it would be an excellent thing for my rickets to take me into Bodmin that day, and get a touch of the dead woman's hand, which in those times was considered an unfailing remedy. So we borrowed the parson's mini cart, and cleaned it thoroughly, and drove it together. The place of the hangings, then, was a little door in the prison wall, looking over the bank where the railway now goes, and a dismal piece of water called Jail Pool, where the townsfolk drowned most of the dogs and cats they'd no further use for. All the bank under the gallows was that thick with people you could almost walk upon their heads, and my ribs were squeezed by the crowd, so I could scarcely breathe freely for a month after. Back across the pool, the fields alongside the valley were lined with booths and sweet stalls and standings, a perfect Whitsun fair, in a din going up that cracked your ears. But there was the stillness of death when the woman came forth, with the sheriff and the chaplain reading in his book, and the unnamed man behind, all from the little door. She wore a straight black gown and a white kerchief about her neck, a lovely woman, young and white and tearless. She ran her eyes over the crowd and stepped forward a pace, as if to speak, but lifted a finger and beckoned instead, and out of the people a man fought his way to the foot of the scaffold. 'Twas the dashing sergeant that was here upon sick leave. Sick he was, I believe. His face above his shining regimentals was grey as slate, for he had committed perjury to save his skin, and on the face of the perjured no sun will ever shine. "Have you got it?" the doomed woman said, merely hearing the words. He tried to reach, but the scaffold was too high, so he tossed up what was in his hand, and the woman caught it, a little screw of tissue paper. "I must see that, please," said the sheriff, laying a hand upon her arm. "'Tis but a wedding ring, sir," and she slipped it over her finger. Then she kissed it once under the beam, and looking into the dragoon's eyes, spoke very slow. "Husband, our child shall go with you, and when I want you, he shall fetch you." And with that turned to the sheriff, saying, "I am ready, sir." The sheriff wouldn't give father and mother leave for me to touch the dead woman's hand, so they drove back that evening, grumbling a good bit. 'Tis a 16-mile drive, and the ostler in at Bodmin had swindled the poor old horse out of his feed, I believe, for he called like a slug. But they were so taken up with discussing the day's doings, and what a mort of people had been present, and how the sheriff might have used milder language in refusing my father, that they forgot to use the whip. The moon was up before we got halfway home, and a star to be seen here and there, and still we never mended our pace. 'Twas in the middle of the lane leading down to Hanger Bottom, where for more than a mile or two carts can't pass each other, that my father picked up his ear and looks back. "Hello," says he, "there's somebody galloping behind us." Far back in the night we heard the noise of a horse's hoofs, pounding furiously on the road and drawing nearer and nearer. "Save us," cries father. "Whoever 'tis, he's coming down the lane." And in a minute's time the clatter was close on us, and someone shouting behind, "Hurry that crawling worm of yourn, or draw aside in God's name, and let me by," the rider yelled. "What's up?" asked my father, quartering as well as he could. "Why, hello, Farmer Hugo, be that you?" "There's a mad devil a man behind riding down all he comes across. He's a blazing drunk, I reckon. But 'tisn't that, 'tis the horrible voice that goes with him. Hark, Lord protect us." He's turned into the lane. Sure enough, the clatter of a second horse was coming down upon us out of the night, and with it the most ghastly sounds that ever creamed a man's flesh. Farmer Hugo pushed past us and sent a shower of mud in our faces as his horse leapt off again, and away to go down the hill. My father stood up and lashed our old gray with the reins, and down we went too, bumpity bump for our lives, the poor beast being taken suddenly like one possessed. For the screaming behind us was like nothing on earth but the wailing and sobbing of a little child, only 10 foot louder. 'Twas just as you'd fancy a baby might wail if his little limbs was being twisted to death. At the hill's foot, as you know, a stream crosses the lane, that widens out there a bit and narrows again as it goes up towards the other side of the valley. Knowing we must be overtaken further on, for the screams and clatter seemed at our very backs by this, father jumped out here into the stream and backed the cart well to one side, and not a second too soon. The next moment, like a wind, this thing went by us in the moonlight, a man upon a black horse that splashed the stream all over us as he dashed through it and up the hill. 'Twas the scarlet dragoon with his ashen face, and behind him, holding to his crossbelt, rode a little shape that tugged and wailed and raved. As I stand here, sir, 'twas the shape of a naked babe. Well, I won't go on to tell how my father dropped upon his knee in the water, or how my mother fainted off. The thing was gone, and from that moment for 8 years nothing was seen or heard of Sergeant Basket. The fright killed my mother. Before next spring she fell into decline, and early next fall the old man, for he was an old man now, had to delve her grave. After this he went feebly about his work, but held on, being wishful for me to step into his shoon, which I began to do as soon as I was 14, having outgrown the rickets by that time. But one cool evening in September month, father was up digging in the yard alone, for 'twas a small child's grave, and in the loosest soil, and I went off on a day's work, thatching Farmer Tressiter's stacks. He was digging away slowly when he heard a rattle at the lich gate, and looking over the edge of the grave, saw in the dusk a man hitching his horse there by the bridle. 'Twas a coal-black horse, and the man wore a scarlet coat, all powdered with pilm. As he opened the gate and came over the graves, father saw 'twas the dashing dragoon. His face was still a slatty grey, and clammy with sweat, and when he spoke his voice was all of a whisper, with a shiver therein. "Bedman," says he, "go to the hedge, and look down the road, and tell me what you see." My father went, with his knees shaking, and came back again. "I see a woman," says he, "not 50 yards down the road. She is dressed in black, and has a veil over her face, and she's coming this way." "Bedman," answers the dragoon, "go to the gate and look back along the Plymouth road, and tell me what you see." "I see," says my father, coming back with his teeth chattering, "I see, 20 yards back, a naked child coming. He looks to be calling, but he makes no sound, because his voice is wearied out," says the dragoon, and with that he faced about and walked to the gate slowly. "Bedman, come with me and see the rest," he says over his shoulder. He opened the gate, unhitched the bridle, and swung himself heavily up in the saddle. Now from the gate the bank goes down pretty steep into the road, and at the foot of the bank my father saw 2 figures waiting. 'Twas the woman and the child, hand in hand, and their eyes burned up like coals, and the woman's veil was lifted, and her throat bare. As the horse went down the bank towards these two, they reached out and took each a stirrup and climbed upon his back, the child before the dragoon, and the woman behind. The man's face was set like a stone. Not a word did he either speak, and in this fashion they rode down the hill toward Rouen Sands. All that my father could mind beyond was that the woman's hands were passed around the man's neck, where the rope had passed around her own. No more could he tell, being a stricken man from that hour. But Anne Polgreen, the housekeeper up to Constantine, saw them an hour later go along the road below the town place, and Jacobs the smith saw them pass his forge towards Bodmin about midnight. So the tale's true enough, but since that night no man has set eyes on horse or riders.